Hello and welcome. This is Lita Downs from the Center for Faculty Excellence, and I would like to welcome you to today's session, Overcoming Students' Writing Anxieties Through Meaningful Connection and Goal Planning. Our presenter, Dr. Miranda Mattingly, originally presented this offering at the Winter 2019 National Faculty Meeting in Tampa, Florida. At this point, I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Mattingly. Welcome.
Thank you, Lita, and welcome everybody. Before we get started, let me introduce myself. My name is Miranda Mattingly, and I am a Manager of Writing Instructional Services in the Office of Writing Instruction in the Writing Center. And I'm really excited to talk to everyone today about not only our goal-setting resources, but how you can use those to make a meaningful connection with students and overcome writing anxieties. Now, to give you a little bit of context, we in the Writing Center throughout 2018 had dedicated some time to developing goal-setting resources to come at the issue of writing skill development and writing anxieties from a more proactive angle. And we're continuing that work in 2019, which is why we thought it would be a good topic for National Faculty Meeting in 2019 with the connection on healthy awareness. So today I'm really excited to have this opportunity to share that same information with additional faculty. So let's kind of dive into our objectives for today. This presentation as a whole has 3 parts, and they kind of reflect some of these objectives. The first 2 kind of relate to the first section of the presentation, and our goal is to highlight challenges to degree completion and writing success, getting that overall context to set the stage for this conversation, but then tying it back to writing specific anxieties, where they show up and when they emerge for students. That's our first section of the presentation. The second section, we're going to talk really about discussing goal setting's impact on writing center anxieties and skill development. We're going to tie it to the writing process in particular in order to see not only where it emerges, but really how it comes to be displayed in how a student sets a goal or how faculty work with students to set goals. And then our last section is really going to be reviewing how to scaffold Writing Center's resources related to goal setting, as well as some of our other just support services that mirror the writing process, that's going to mirror the course development process, so you can learn how to engage with these conversations with the work that you're already doing. So that's our objectives for today. Let's go on and dive right in. So to give a little bit of a broader picture, I always kind of start with this particular stat and study. It is a little bit older, 2009, but what it's essentially highlighting is this overall invisible problem, and it's related to the rate of doctoral completion and how it remains consistently around 50% nationwide, which is quite high. But I do think, since I said before that 2009 is a little bit dated, there's been quite a bit of push in higher education to kind of address this concern. And my example is consistently, I always think of the increased use of doctoral coaching and mentoring. That seems to be a trend that's really developed that's, targeted at this individualized support. Regardless, the connection here of the study itself is highlighting the fact that students, for a variety of reasons, whether they list things about being ashamed, stressed, plagued by debt, that graduate students leave graduate programs, without much notice. And our goal today is kind of to unpack that a little bit in context with larger factors in anxiety. Now, there are different factors to consider in the bigger picture, and I've listed a few here. Consistently, time management, whether it's that balance between family, career, and school, is one that's ranked very highly as impacting doctoral or just graduate degree completion. Writing anxieties, as you will probably guess, will be our main topic for today, but is also consistently ranked as a high factor in degree completion. There's also a real common factor related to research skills. This extends, it connects to writing, but extends to the ability to do research, critical reading, organization skill, familiarity with databases. There's a lot more that goes into that one, but it's still a really common factor to degree completion. As I noted before, debt is something that plays a huge role. I know in my generation it was a consideration that continues on today. And then another one, although I will say that this is just a short list and there are other ones to consider that we highlighted, or at least I pulled from the research, was imposter syndrome, which is really this connection or this idea that students feel that somehow they've lucked into the success that they've received, the program that they're in, and they don't actually have the abilities and they're really just fooling people. And at some point in time, they're going to be discovered. It's really about lack of confidence and the anxiety associated with that. Now, as I noted, we're going to talk primarily about writing anxieties today. And the way that writing anxieties actually come to be displayed can be in various forms. And I'm going to talk through or at least highlight a few of them. But again, there's more to be considered. So, a few of them to consider are avoidance of writing related courses and degrees, kind of moving away from anything that is really writing intensive into a different degree. In this case, with online education, that can be a little more difficult because of discussion posts just taking additional writing. But regardless, there is a consistent trend in the research that shows just avoiding writing degrees if there's a lack of confidence in this area. Another one that I think faculty see quite a bit, and we see it at the Writing Center as well, is underdeveloped ideas, analysis, and synthesis. Making that transition to academic writing can be a big jump, and as a result, the anxieties that kind of come with that can really impact the overall idea development, the analysis development, and so on. Procrastination and missed deadlines is quite common. I see this often in teaching myself that when you have those anxieties, it can impact your ability just to sit down and do the work or pushing it off in some way. This kind of relates to the one of the last points here about avoiding class when a writing assignment is due. Students might come when there's reading, there's discussion, but when a major assessment is actually due, they avoid class altogether. And then the last one is refusal to seek writing help. We might also call this just a reluctance. Anxiety is kind of fueling that vulnerability that is reaching out for writing support. Now, when we kind of talk about these things, I wanted to tie it more specifically, the anxieties itself, to not how they just come to be displayed, but how they impact writing in particular, because that's what we're trying to get to, closer and closer to understanding writing anxieties and their connection to the writing process so that we can find a meaningful way to interact with students at this stage or throughout the process really in its entirety. And again, several here, more than I can probably list, but let's highlight a few of them. The lack of confidence and skills, this again comes back to this idea of students just, it could not having confidence because they think that they've lucked into it, that imposter syndrome again. It could be from criticism from past, and that's a lack of confidence that's kind of impacting their writing skills. Another one is related to labor and process of work. This is just about the amount of time that it actually takes to complete a writing assignment, whether it's a discussion post or a major assessment. When you make that transition to academic writing, students may often have a really misconceived notion of what it takes to get to a polished piece of academic writing. But on the same level, even in like a discussion post in the online setting where you have to have more developed ideas, we always at the Writing Center talk about it's your place to practice core fundamental features of academic writing from the thesis statement to organizational development. The fact that that takes more time is something that can be quite a bit of source of anxiety. There is a great deal of personal vulnerability when it comes to writing, and you're going to see it kind of crop up in these later examples. But just putting yourself out there, not only in terms of reaching for help, but also its own connection to what the writing says about you as a writer, even though we're going to kind of complicate that in a moment. Fear of feedback is a really common one, just having that previous knowledge that a student has of how their work has been assessed, whether positive, negative. It can also be related to too much feedback, too little. All of that can allow students' minds to kind of run and think about what they're missing, what they're lacking as a student writer or an academic writer. Another one to highlight, and I know that when I was doing my dissertation, this one came up quite a bit, which is perfectionism and fear of disappointing the committee. I know that a lot of times students can spend quite a long time, probably perhaps too long of a time, working on an individual chapter. And for some cases, it's not necessarily related to feedback fear. It's more of just not wanting to produce a product that isn't fully up to not only a perfect standard, but just the standard of the committee, and that weighing heavily on students and their ability to make progress. There is a connection here as well to the belief that writing is a reflection of your own intelligence. And I think that we know as faculty that students come from all types of backgrounds. Oftentimes, they're just trying to get words on the page. They might not be as familiar with scholarly convention. They may be working from multiple language and kind of transferring between. And all of those things can impact the writing that's coming to be displayed on the page, but it's not necessarily a reflection of their intelligence by any means. Our students here at Walden are often very advanced in their careers and have a great deal of professional knowledge and expertise, and writing is just a particular area where they struggle to communicate that knowledge. There is a connection here as well to unrealistic writing expectations. Again, it can be related to time commitment. It can be related to the skill level in order to to engage and achieve scholarly writing, but not fully understanding the convention. And here I'm moving already into the last one, but not fully understanding the conventions of scholarly writing and what it actually takes to reach that level, and understanding it's its own genre. And the last one I wanted to highlight was simply that writing is not seen as may not be seen as students connected to their profession. They might see academic writing and scholarly writing as not something they use other than in coursework. They don't necessarily see how it's their skills they're developing that can be translated in some way. So when we kind of talk about these things, what our goal is to kind of is connect it to the writing process. And for us in the Writing Center, we break the writing process in different parts. And what I'm essentially doing on this slide is highlighting where some of these anxieties crop up in the writing process. I'm not going to say that they're the only place. It's just kind of an example to walk it through. So if we start with pre-writing, we're really talking about the brainstorming stage, the researching of materials, the organizing of ideas, all that work you do before you get to the full writing process. And in that area, there's lots of ways that students' anxieties can crop up. Maybe it's a lack of confidence about their skills that weighing on them in the past. Maybe it's not really realizing the full understanding of the labor that it takes to do the research, then to annotate it, to critically read it and then annotate it, right? And organize it into an outline that's ready to be move forward into a draft. This can be connected again to the notion of an unfamiliarity with scholarly convention and what that process looks like, whether it is using research, using several sources of research, or it may be related more towards the process of annotating it, right? And then getting that material down so they're ready to move on to the writing process. Fear of past feedback kind of crops up throughout the process, and it can be a barrier for students just to start to write. It can also, as we're going to see in a moment, be a barrier to students finish writing like a draft of something. So if we move into the drafting process, perfectionism and fear of disappointing committee, that's another one, as I said before, just can have students get bogged down in the writing process and then not wanting to turn it in until they feel like it's absolutely perfect, which I think we all know is not a standard that is met often or ever. There's also that belief that writing is that reflection of intelligence, and how the words get organized on the page if they're just not quite right, not necessarily wanting to share it because they want to make sure that they're not showing something about their own intelligence, which is not necessarily the case. The labor and work of writing, I think this, I've talked about this before about as not necessarily understanding perhaps the research that goes into it, how to organize and annotate it. But when we come to the drafting stage, we're often talking about the fact that students may not realize that they're going to have to write more than one draft, how long the conventions that are associated with an academic piece as well could be something connected to like the labor and work of writing. And then again, those feedback fears kind of cropping up in their ability to get the content down because they're worrying too much about past feedback related to sentence structure or vice versa. When it comes to revising and feedback, so we've moved past the draft itself, but instead we're talking about we've gotten some feedback at some level and knowing what to do with that material. At that moment, we have a great sense of students' personal vulnerability, taking in that material, not connecting it to themselves, but seeing that material and that feedback is something designed to help them get the ideas more polished rather than a reflection of themselves. Unrealistic expectations, again, perhaps related to the fact that they write one draft and that's all they really needed to do. But in scholarly writing, that's not really the case. It takes much more time. And that again is that connection again to overall unfamiliarity with scholarly convention, thinking that maybe they could get away with one source when they actually need to be involved with a full scholarly conversation. But overall, these are just a few examples of how writing anxieties can emerge in the writing process. Definitely not the only way. So what we really wanted to highlight in giving you that example is to come back around to the notion of writing and that it can be learned. Even scholarly writing can be learned. And if you interact with the Writing Center, this is actually one of our mantras. We say this all the time. And it's really because we strongly believe that writing, even scholarly writing, is built on common foundational skills. And reiterating that message can be really helpful for students because we've moved from anxieties to skills, and that's really one thing we want to make that shift. When we talk about overcoming writing anxieties, it does again take some openness, some emotional risk taking. So we want to make sure that we acknowledge that and we're kind of aware of that aspect as we engage with students in this area. And one way we kind of talk about this is to make sure that we're starting with the idea of building on confidence, building a strong writing process, as well as identifying a support system, whether it's the people that you're working with, from faculty to writing center staff to students, peers in some way, or identifying resources that can kind of help them in the process. And we're going to kind of talk about how we can map those resources and support systems up against the writing process today. But ultimately, we like to add the note that writing inevitably is a process that's unique to the individual, and that can impact this as a whole. So we kind of have to cater to them. But at the same time, our goal here is to really talk about how goals can actually make that an easier process for faculty and students. Now we've reached the end of this first section, and I wanted to add a moment of reflection here before we move on. And so I've posed a question for you to consider, for the listeners to consider. And in this case, it's how do you manage students' writing anxieties? What techniques or practices do you use? Now I'm going to take a pause here to let you think and reflect on it. And then in a few moments, I'm going to jump back on and I'll talk through some typical responses. Okay, I'm going to jump back in here. So when it comes to how do you manage students' writing anxieties, I think there's a variety of ways you can respond here. I'm just going to highlight a very few of them. So one thing I hear faculty often say is one of the first things that they do is they always acknowledge the strengths that the students have. And a case in point, it might be acknowledging that the content or the ideas are there, but we want to really focus on ways that we can identify skills to help them present that information more effectively. So we kind of build on that confidence piece of it already. Another technique that I often hear faculty say is that throughout the course, they try and use announcements to identify different patterns that they see in students' writing and connect them to a resource, which is a really great tool to maybe kind of address it on a broader level rather than tackling individually with students that can help them mitigate any type of anxieties. So in that case, we have both an individual technique, but also how to address it from like a class perspective. Now, we're going to talk through several more today, but that's just like a little sampling, and I'm sure that you, the listener, have some great ideas to add to that conversation as well. So let's move on to the next section. Now, in this section, we're really talking about, or we're trying to shift towards talking about how writing goals can enter into this conversation about overcoming students' anxieties. And when we talk about writing goals, we're going to talk about how they kind of address several different pieces. So we're talking about not only its ability to work with student skills, to address and engage with setting expectations that are reasonable and manageable, giving students confidence in the skills that they have, the abilities they have, the process that they're setting. And then also using writing goals as a way to establish not only a connection with students, but that sense of support, whether it's the relationship you build with faculty, you build with them, um, connecting them to Writing Center staff that can support them, or just with resources. So we're going to kind of group all of those together and how we talk about writing goals today. So in order to do that, I kind of wanted to parse through several different reasons why writing goals matter, why goals in general matter, but how it can be specifically applied to the writing process. So the first one is really, as I mentioned at the very top of the presentation, the way in which writing goals focus on learned skills over past proficiencies. When I was talking at the beginning of the presentation, we were saying or I was saying the Writing Center was really interested in this proactive approach. Too often in the Writing Center, we have students come to us and say they want the paper edited. And we're really big advocates of giving students the tools in order to become self-sufficient in their ability to become strong scholarly writers and revisers. So in this regard, we're really focused on identifying those skills, and using writing goals has been a great tool for us to kind of connect to those skills, but connect them outward to a larger goal that the student has. Helping students set manageable expectation and action steps. Goals are actually a really great way of doing this. We're going to talk about how to set reasonable goals and manageable goals rather than broader goals that can be difficult to achieve. But goals is really about establishing and having a conversation about what you want, what a student wants to achieve, and kind of identifying those steps. How do you break it down in some way, and having a conversation about it. Writing goals can help motivation, application, and retention of writing feedback in particular. Goals are always a great motivator because it's the sense of like proactive, where do I want to be and what do I want to become? So we have that motivation piece, which is great. But what the research also reflects is goals help with application and retention. You are having some type of accountability set in place, and as a result, you're kind of trying to get to that place. So you're looking very closely about how to apply feedback, how to retain it in some way. And we're actually going to look at tools specifically today that highlight that fact. It can bolster confidence and self-awareness of the writing skills and the progress as a whole. Too often in the goal setting process, and I think this is true of not just writing goals, but just goals in general, it's hard to understand what progress you're making, how your skills are developing. So it's not just about building confidence as a whole. Sometimes it's about literally seeing your progress and how goals can make that concretize that process and make it visible for students. It also highlights the smaller accomplishments that are more reflective of the writing process. I always tell students that writing is not an overnight miraculous transformation. I've never seen that happen. I would love to see that happen and then like interview that person and figure out what they did. But for the most part, writing progress, skill development is smaller accomplishments. They tend to be sparsed out over time and can make it difficult to see. But the goal setting process kind of reflects that. You take so many steps forward, you might take a few steps back. You might take a few more steps forward. And the idea here is about making sure that goals can help you continue with that motivation and still build confidence along the way as you move towards progress. And then lastly, writing goals can really help students to instill writing and revisions with a greater sense of purpose. Connecting to the fact that the revisions they're making, while important, do apply to the revision of the current assignment they are working on, but it's also working on a skill that's going to translate across the assignment. and hopefully to the larger field or profession that they're moving towards with their degree. So when we talk about writing goals, I like to, before we dive right into them, I like to highlight what students know and what they're still working to develop. Now, as a whole, and this isn't just specific to writing goals, it's just goals setting in general. Tends to be a familiarity with what goal setting is. If you mention goals, most people will know what you are talking about, right? And in that sense, in that regard, students will often know how to set a goal generally. We have that quite often in the Writing Center. We do have an option for students to share their goals, and they tend to be very broad, and so that generally they kind of understand. Students often understand their overall writing process, the common habits they have. They might not be able to understand the hindrance or the obstacles they face in it in a more nuanced way, but the overall process, and similarly, their strengths and weaknesses as a writer, what they struggle with, what they think they do well, these can be complicated, but regardless, in a broad sense. What they have yet to develop is more complex, right? The ability to assess progress over time, skill development, as I mentioned before, goal setting is meant to step in and help in this regard, but that ability to see writing is something that they are actually making progress on, which can be hard as you're doing those daily, or not daily, but those weekly discussion flows, those major assessments. The ability to define action steps and reasonable expectations for goals. In this regard, we're talking about setting goals that are manageable, but then also identifying the tools, the resources, the steps you need to achieve these larger goals, or how to scaffold them into a series of goals that you can achieve the larger objective you're focusing on. Methods for overcoming reading anxieties. That in and of itself is the topic of this entire presentation. But goals can kind of, again, shift that process to a more proactive approach and not getting bogged down into deficiencies. Confidence as their skills as a whole is something that goals is designed to help with, but may not be something students connect to quite yet. Accountability and consistency in working towards goals. We're really going to look at ways today that the resources that we've developed in the writing centers, as well as some of the services we have, can build greater accountability and consistency as students work towards their goals. Effective practices for interpreting and applying feedback. That in itself can be quite a challenge for students. They get the feedback, they don't know how to interpret, it's overwhelming and it's anxiety filled for them, right? But our goal is to give them some practices, how to break down that process, set aside the emotion, look for the skill themselves, connect it back to the larger objective that they're working toward. And then finally, connections between projects and application to future career. If they don't see that connection, it can be hard to see the larger purpose. So here's another moment. I've already reached the end of the second section. I think the last section takes the most time. But what I wanted to highlight here was some examples of writing goals we often see in the Writing Center and kind of talk through what the challenges are associated with this goal. So let me highlight first what the goals are, and then I'll highlight what the question is associated with it. So you have three goals. My writing goal is to be a better scholarly writer. That's our first one. Second one is I aim to write an error-free paper. The third one is I want to learn how to get an A on my paper. Each of these goals we see really commonly in the Writing Center. And so what I'm really wanting to hear from you all as you think through this process is how might you respond to these students' writing goals? Are the goals effective? Why or why not? And as with the previous little activity, I'm going to go on mute for just a moment to give you a little bit of time to reflect, and then I'll talk through some of these examples. Okay, great. So let's talk through a couple of these. In and of itself, these goals aren't necessarily bad. We always like to say these are admirable goals. However, they can be difficult to achieve. They can be beyond the student's control, can be broad. And that's kind of the theme that we see through all of these. So in the first one, we're actually going to use this first one in the next couple of slides as a greater example. But in a broader sense, when we see this really common goal, my run goal is to be a better scholarly writer, it's quite broad and how to tackle it, where to begin, what are the action steps you're going to take, what's the process. That is a challenge in and of itself. I aim to write an error-free paper. That is that notion of perfectionism that can be very difficult to achieve, despite being admirable in its efforts. And then the last one we have, I want to learn how to get an A on my paper, right? That is beyond the student's control. They aren't the ones doing the assessment. So we want to kind of shift it back to skills that they can focus on, something that is within their control. So there's just three different ways that we can kind of talk about the ways in which we want to shift focus, kind of talk through these goals. And our process moving forward is to highlight ways that you too can kind of engage with breaking these goals down into something that perhaps can be a little more effective, but also to tie you and the student to resources that can help you along the way. So as I said before, I wanted to highlight that first one, right? Like I want to be a better scholarly writer. That's really common for students to say. And if you have that goal in and of itself, while again admirable, can be quite stressful because we don't necessarily know what the student needs to focus on. When we talk about scholarly writing, maybe we're talking about thesis statements, maybe we're talking about organization. In organization, evidence and paraphrasing at the paragraph level. Maybe it's grammar, APA that's kind of slowing this process down, making it more anxiety filled for students, right? Scholarly writing has many, many different aspects. However, if I just pull out one of them and I say that the goal is really about scholarly writing and organization, well, from my perspective as a writing center staff, I think like, how am I going to engage with that? Organization is a huge topic. Are we talking about global organization of the paper? Are we talking about at the paragraph level? I gave you the example of actually the paragraph level when we looked to the graphic on the right side. So if I was kind of engaging with this as a student, I'm going to want to break this down into parts with them. And ultimately what we would want is to set goals for each one of these. So for example, if I was working with a student on a paper, I might start with one paper simply focused on topic sentences. Topic sentences is a great way to do organization because it makes sure that paragraphs have one single focus. And then we can dive into how that one focus needs to develop. So we're really at the stage of idea development before we even get to organization. But regardless, getting the paragraph focused on one main idea is a degree of organization, right? So I might deal with that one in a paper. Maybe I do that over two papers, right? But if not, I can kind of move on. And then next time I'm working with the students, talk about evidence and analysis balance. So in this case, the paragraph might have its single focus, but now we got to figure out how to make sure that the idea is supported with evidence, but they're actually engaging with analyzing the evidence, kind of bringing their own conversation to the scholarly discussion that's been in the field already. And then that it kind of allows, once we make this progression, to tie back out to greater synthesis. How does the main idea from this paragraph connect back out to the larger argument in the paper or some type of lead out and transition between paragraphs? So as you can see here, the overall goal, I want to be a better scholarly writer. When we break it down into more manageable parts, more reasonable expectations, it makes the process less anxiety filled, easier to achieve, more reflective of the writing process, and that's really what we're trying to get moved towards. So when we developed our writing center resources related to goal setting, we started with the SMART model, but what we ultimately wanted to do was connect it to the writing process. So what we essentially did is we drew on some resources from the Academic Skill Center. So they have a really great resource on how to set a goal using the SMART model, so specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. But our goal of the Writing Center was to make that more unique and specific to the writing process. So I'm going to move in the latter half of the presentation to talk through resources, but our goal here was to really tie it to writing specific skill, again, making it within their control, the routine that they have as writers, as well as kind of learning a little bit about their learning style and understanding that process and its impact on their skill development, connecting it to a support system and resources that kind of help students achieve along the way. So in this regard, I'm going to do a more detailed view about our resources and how you can introduce them in a way that mirrors the writing process as well as your own course development. But one of the first things I wanted to highlight, since we were really talking about how to set reasonable and manageable goals, was the tool we developed, which is our writing goal journal. When you have access to these slides, the phrase writing goal journal is actually linked to our template itself. And while the screenshot here of the journal is quite small, I can briefly highlight what it essentially does. And what it essentially does is it enables the students to think through what their goal is, why their goal is important, but also what resources they need to achieve that goal. That's the upper section. And then it has a chart below where they identify specific steps that they need. So that's that scaffolding moment. They have the date there for when they're going to do that. So we set a timeline in place. They have an option to identify what feedback applies to the goal or step that they're taking, right? As well as the action they took in response to that feedback. And in this case, we're applying it to more manageable steps. It allows students to see the progress that they're making. We kind of have these pieces come together. So you do have manageable expectations being set. It's an organizational tool for students because it brings it all into one space. It creates a degree of accountability because they have steps they've outlined in connection with a timeline, and they can kind of see that as a time saver in that way as well because they have the feedback and the resources all in the same space. And ultimately, we're trying to identify not only the process, but the progress and building in some type of rewards throughout the way. So in this regard, just as a bit of a recap before we look at our more specific resources, setting effective writing goals is a conversation about focusing on skills and not problems or deficiencies, encouraging students to set manageable goals with reasonable expectations, but also directing students to supportive resources that provide them with self-efficacy and accountability. And it's this last piece that we're going to dive into in the last part of this presentation. What are those resources and how can they be introduced in a way that creates increased self-efficacy and accountability? So to do that, we're shifting here to both those resources and the next steps that you can take as faculty members. So what I essentially want to do is I want to kind of mirror how writing resources can be applied in connection with the writing process. So maybe it's about related announcements or resources that reflect the writing process, but also how that writing process is kind of emerging throughout the way that your course develops. And so we're going to do that process as a whole while also highlighting, taking somewhat of a kind of tour of the Writing Center website. So the writing process as a whole, we spend a lot of time with Writing Center talking and thinking about the writing process. In fact, we have an entire page that's actually on the left side of the screen here. It's a little small, so on the right side, I identified the pages that are actually on that website page. And even in the sub-pages, overviews, goal setting, we have more and more resources. So the writing process as a whole, we have it broken down as we have an overview. We introduced our goal setting resources to kind of start off the writing process in a more proactive way. But then working through those stages we've seen before, pre-writing, drafting, we build out academic argument as a central piece of scholarly writing, revising and proofreading, and then reflecting and improving to kind of think it back through the process so that when students move on to a new assignment, they're kind of connecting how that assignment moves forward to the next one. So in this regard, what I'm essentially doing is highlighting some of the resources that we have under this, so that if we have a sense of what the resources are, when we move into the application to how you might introduce them into a course, we know what we were talking about, right? So goal setting. Under goal setting, this is what we added in 2018 and we're building out in 2019. In that regard, we have resources related to why to set a writing goal, how to set one, examples of effective goals, and then also how to achieve them. On the slides themselves, each one of these are actually linkable, that text, so you'll be able to find the resource themselves. Pre-writing, there's a lot that can go into this one, but critical reading, brainstorming, outlining, and organizing thoughts. Drafting, I only gave you a small taste of this one because there was way more that could fit in the little box, but highlighting just the introduction, the thesis statement, and writer's block. These are all resources that can be introduced at the drafting stage. And then once we've given some type of feedback to a student, it never hurts to introduce revising resources, right? Which is something we can often forget. So whether it's revising based on feedback, maybe you notice that your class as a whole, there's a reoccurring pattern with something related to organization or scholarly voice. We have more than that, but those are just two examples. That might be a resource to introduce, or revising for writing goals. That was one of those resources that we actually added because we want to make sure that goals is not something you just set, but you hold students, we enable students to hold themselves accountable to those goals. So here what we're kind of shifting towards is how to relate these goal setting resources to the writing process, but also the course development. So, for example, in week 1 or week 2, right, when the courses you're starting, it never hurts to think about setting a goal. So this might be a moment and opportunity to set that or to introduce that how to set a writing goal web page. This could be a goal for the week. It could be a goal for the course. It could be a goal that they kind of set for their whole degree. It can be applied in different ways, but introducing it can't hurt. In the goal, how to set a writing goal webpage itself, it walks the student through the writing process, their learning style, those obstacles, get the big picture of who they are as a writer. And then it kind of moves into exercises that help students to think about skills, areas of improvement in order to understand how to set a goal, and then encourages them to use the SMART goal model. Again, we kind of rely on a resource from the Academic Skills Center, so shout out to the Academic Skills Center. But then kind of setting it within reasonable expectations that are associated with the writing process in particular. So this is, we kind of highlight this as a way for students to move towards setting the goal, right? What you might consider is another way to introduce supportive resources that help students through the writing process, moments of high anxiety, the week before a major assessment, right? This might be considering a moment about idea development or organization. So I'm using the example of perhaps introducing our outlining web page. Our outlining web page is really interesting because it not just gives general outlining strategies, it actually then walks the student through about how to apply those strategies to the entirety of a paper. So the introduction, the thesis statement or purpose statement, the background, major points and minor points, and then the conclusion. So it's kind of walking them through the process as a whole in order to mitigate anxieties that might be emerging at this point in the writing process or in the course. Similarly, if you kind of introduce some writing resources before a major assessment, there might be an opportunity once you hit a week after returning feedback on a major assessment. So in this case, we're really focused on revision. Now, before, I kind of highlighted some of those resources that we have available. I think that the revising based on feedback is a great one because we know that students' anxieties often relate to how to interpret feedback, seeing that feedback as a reflection of their own abilities. And this feedback resource can help them to see how they can kind of move and set aside emotions and look at the skills themselves. What is the ways that they can really make sure that they're applying that feedback to the work that they are working on that assignment or future assignments? However, as I said before, we have several different revising resources, focus ideas, evidence, scholarly voice, grammar. And then we added one, as I said before, about revising for writing goals. So it never hurts if you've had students set a goal at the beginning, week 1, week 2, to introduce the revising resource for writing goals as a way to hold greater accountability and proactive engagement with that conversation you started at the beginning of the year. So those are just a few examples of how it applies to course development or the writing process, but I wanted to highlight a few other resources and tools or support services that we want to offer faculty and that we offer through the Writing Center. So one thing to consider is borrowing language from announcements or for announcements and feedback. Um, Amber Cook, our Associate Director of Faculty Outreach, is a great resource, and I'm sure that many of you know her. And what she's done is gathered together classroom announcements, whether it's about weekly writing tips, weekly APA tips that can be shared with students that kind of connect them to common patterns related to these areas and the resource. So that's an option for you. It's kind of like almost a cut and paste thing. Like you don't have to do the work. We kind of see and know what students often struggle with. She also has different resources, whether they are more documents that you can download or webinars, recorded webinars. So there's also live ones that are going on, and you should check the schedule. They kind of can help faculty with how to provide effective feedback. They kind of engages with skill development, how to scaffold writing feedback so that if you see a project that has so many patterns that need to be addressed, how to figure out which to prioritize, how to do that effectively. So that's another way to think about resources that are available to help engage with student skill development and as well as their goals. And then what I'll also highlight is she does have a monthly update newsletter for faculty that if you're not enrolled or would like to be, feel free to email her at ambercook@mail.waldenu.edu. Two more resources that I wanted to highlight. Hopefully you are familiar with our course visits, but if you are not, it might be helpful to schedule a course visit. So what I'm going to highlight here is the basics of the course visits as well as some revisions that we made last year that actually kind of relate to goal setting. So the basics of our course visit is that we have two types of course visits, asynchronous and synchronous course visits. I'd say asynchronous is a little bit more popular just because our student body is often engaging asynchronously. And what we essentially do in a course visit is you would have a Writing Center professional visit your course for 1 week's worth of time. And during that time, it enables students to ask questions and discover writing resources. And in many ways, for faculty members, it allows students to engage with someone rather than placing all of that burden on you to do that work with writing when often your focus is on content development and getting students acclimated to the field or the discipline, the content, the material of the course. We can kind of step in and help more specific questions related to writing, to APA, grammar, and that's one of our roles in that. And I included the link there at the bottom how you can request a course visit. Now, as I mentioned, there actually are some new features that we did in our recent revision to some of the content of our course visits, and I wanted to highlight those. So previously, our course visits were often resource driven. And what we did now is we wanted to change it where we can do more instruction. So they're actually topic driven now towards content. And in this case, faculty can choose 4 topics to be reviewed, often based on patterns that they see in students' writing. I think we have 30 total topics that you can choose from. The other thing that we do in addition, because we're talking about a full week's worth of time, is our first day post is actually a goal activity. And what we have students do is set a goal or share their writing goals, whether they are related to the class that week or more generally. I'd say that students most often do it more generally. They share what their goals are. And then that allows us to more proactively engage with their writing anxieties because they may not have a question. They might be feeling vulnerable. If they have a question, it shows that they don't know something. But if they share their writing goal, it allows us to identify resources and provide additional instruction without them having to identify that they don't know something in particular. There's also, we also revised our course content for enhanced student engagement so that we would have more conversation and dialogue in that space. The other thing that you can always think about is inviting students to set up a paper review. This is kind of our premier, not kind of, it is our premier service at the Writing Center. There are some basics that if you are not familiar with the paper review service that I wanted to highlight. And in this case, students basically upload a paper to our MyPass system. It is asynchronous feedback, so they do have access to it at any time. Within 1 to 2 days of uploading their paper, students will get individualized feedback based on their particular project. Smaller projects do work as instructors have a limited amount of time to provide feedback, but we really, again, focus on skills and patterns in their writing so that we can make the most of our time and that students can then take our feedback and apply it. We have 3 schedules, one for undergraduates, graduates, and pre-proposals. We do work primarily at that level. Once students have their prospectus approved, they would move over to the Office of Editing. And students can make up to 2 appointments per week. And students are expected within those 2 appointments to revise between appointments because we are encouraging students to work on skill development and self-efficacy. Additional recommendations we have is to make a connection to a specific goal or a specific skill or a potential goal clear. If you see students' work and you want to recommend them to the Writing Center, saying just go to the Writing Center can be overwhelming for students. But if you kind of identify a skill or even more specifically a goal, which can be more proactive in some ways, they want to work with, they have the option to share that material with us. To do that, as I said before, Amber actually does have language for making those recommendations and announcements and feedback. So that's an option if you're looking for ways to word it in particular for students. You can also encourage, as I said before, share students' goal for students to share their goal with the Writing Center staff. I'm going to highlight quickly in just a moment about where that is. The other thing you can consider is challenging students to enroll in our new Goal Plans pilot, which we're developing this year. So you're getting a bit of a sneak preview. So these last 2 points are just highlighting things that you consider, one of them which is already in place, but the other one is coming. So let's take a quicker look, right? So I said that students can share their writing goal, and this is something they can already do. This is, again, a small screenshot, but right there in the middle, students share overall, like what course they're in, where they are in the writing process, what they want us to look like, but we do ask them to set a writing goal. And you can see right here that what is your writing goal, and then in this case, it's to how to balance the evidence and analysis. And that enables us to provide more individualized feedback to students' work, but also the things that they're working towards as a whole. The last thing I want to highlight, because we're at the end of our presentation, is a new pilot that we are developing in 2019. It's not live yet, but you're getting kind of a sneak preview. And this is challenging students to enroll in our goal plan. So in 2019, we're developing a pilot that allows students to opt into a goal plan that spans across paper reviews. And what that essentially means is that students may complete a short module, it's an intake module for us. It helps students work through the process of how to set an effective goal. It actually even goes beyond that. It helps them to break it down into manageable parts. It allows them to set it into more of a plan. And then at the end of the module, they have the option to share that goal plan with us and enroll in our goal plan service or our pilot. They can also just share the goal and get resources, and we'll just provide resources if they prefer to do it on their own. But we're offering the pilot as a more individualized way to support students. If they do choose to opt into the pilot, our Writing Center representative will respond within 48 hours. And this guarantees students 4 appointments in our paper review service. And in those 4 appointments, our goal is to really help students work towards that writing goal that they selected in the module. At that point, a writing instructor will provide goal-driven feedback, resources, as well as action steps for each paper review and in between each paper review so they kind of know what they need to do for the next one. And then finally, in between the paper reviews, to maintain motivation, accountability, and retention, we're actually doing an extended layer of communication with a student where they're receiving check-in communications that allows for additional instruction, encouragement, and related resources to help them through the process. So they're not feeling like they're ever isolated or alone, but someone is there. Now, as I mentioned, the goal plan is still in development and the pilot starting later in 2019. If you are interested in learning more, feel free to reach out to me, Miranda Mattingly, at mirandamattingly at mail.woldenu.edu. Now, we're at the end of our presentation, and I just wanted to highlight a few of the overall learning objectives that we touched on throughout today's presentation. And simply that writing anxiety is a significant factor and degree in completion. However, we wanted to make sure that we place this in context with the fact that writing stress as a whole does require emotional risk-taking on the behalf of the student and being aware of how we can engage with that in a more proactive way and a healthy way. Writing development as a whole starts with a strong writing process and support, which is why we were trying to connect not only the anxieties to the writing process, but resources where you can engage in the writing process effectively. Goals is really about building on confidence, building on student skill development and retention, and self-efficacy. So it's not just setting the goal, but kind of moving it all the way through the process. Effective writing goals should be focused and timely and manageable. That's kind of going back to the SMART goal model, but also understood in connection with the writing process in particular. And then lastly, as you can't tell from this entire presentation, the Writing Center as a whole is always ready to support writing goal success, whether it's student or your own faculty writing goals that you have. So feel free to reach out to us at any time. If you would like to reach out to us, we have different ways that you can contact us. Faculty questions as a whole should be directed to Amber Cook, again, our Associate Director of Faculty Outreach and Support, with her email right there listed at the below, ambercook.com, or not .com, at mail.waldenu.edu. If you have a question that you want to direct a student to the Writing Center in particular, we do like to remind faculty that we have two offices in the Writing Center. The Office of Writing Instructors is my end of the shop. We work with students in coursework or at the pre-proposal stage. And in that case, we're also working with organization, idea development, grammar, scholarly writing, APA. And students can contact us at writingsupport@waldenu.edu. There is a 24-hour reply time. If students have a approved prospectus, those communications and questions should be sent to our Office of Editing, so our editors, and they work with students who are working on their dissertation and doctoral studies, project studies, the form and style review. And they can be reached at editor@waldenu.edu and have a 24 reply. If you want to learn more about some of the resources in particular, we also like to highlight our faculty toolbox. And in that case, that's really those announcements, those resources for providing effective feedback are on that particular website that Amber actually manages. So if you have questions, again, you can always reach out to Amber Cook as our main point of contact. Otherwise, I've had such a lovely time speaking with everyone, and I really hope that you enjoyed listening to today's presentation on overcoming students' writing anxieties through meaningful connection and goal planning. If you have ever questions, feel free to reach out to us at the Writing Center. So thank you so much.